Peppa Pig. Something is wrong with Peppa. One rainy morning, Peppa woke up earlier than usual. Her room seemed normal, but something felt off. She looked in the mirror and noticed her reflection appeared strange, slightly distorted. Maybe it's just my imagination, she thought, and went down for breakfast. Throughout the day, Peppa noticed her friends acting differently. Susie, usually cheerful, kept her distance and barely spoke to her. During playtime, Susie finally said, "You look strange today." Peppa frowned but didn't reply. Later, while playing in the yard, she caught her reflection in a puddle. Her eyes seemed darker, and her smile was unnervingly wide, almost creepy. She blinked and the reflection looked normal again. By evening, her family started noticing changes in her behavior. Peppa was unusually quiet, no longer laughing, and her occasional smiles seemed unsettling. "Are you feeling okay, dear?" Mummy Pig asked at dinner. "Yes, Mummy," Peppa replied, but her voice sounded lower and stranger than usual. Late that night, George woke up to strange whispers coming from Peppa's room. He tiptoed to her door and peeked inside. She was standing in front of her mirror, whispering something, but her reflection wasn't moving in sync. It seemed alive, moving on its own. "Peppa?" George asked, his voice trembling. She slowly turned toward him, and for a brief moment, her eyes glowed red. "Go back to bed, George," she said in a voice that wasn't hers. The next day, things got even worse. Peppa became aggressive, breaking George's toys and ripping books. She seemed to enjoy it, laughing in a hoarse, chilling tone that made Mummy and Daddy Pig exchange worried glances. Later that night, loud noises came from Peppa's room. Her parents rushed upstairs to find her standing by the window. She didn't move, but her shadow on the wall writhed and twisted as if it had a life of its own. "Peppa, what are you doing?" Mummy Pig asked, her voice shaking. "I'm not Peppa," she said, turning slowly. Her eyes were completely black, and her smile was unnaturally wide. The next morning, the house was empty. No one knew what had happened to Mummy, Daddy, or George. The camera slowly panned to the kitchen, where Peppa sat alone at the table. She smiled, her eyes still dark and empty. The mysterious shadow. One evening, as Peppa and her family were preparing for dinner, the house started to grow dark faster than usual. Daddy Pig turned on the living room light, but the bulb immediately went out, leaving the room in semi-darkness. Soon, the lights in the whole house started to dim, and Peppa felt that something was wrong. Mummy Pig tried to turn on other lights, but without success. Peppa suggested opening the windows to let in some light, but when they did, there was nothing visible outside. No yard, no familiar trees, just endless darkness. Peppa closed the window, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. Daddy Pig suggested they go outside and see what was happening. But as soon as he opened the door, the entire house was suddenly plunged into complete darkness. Peppa, Mummy, and Daddy stood in the dark hallway, hearing only each other's footsteps and a faint rustling sound. Then Peppa noticed a strange shadow moving across the walls. At first, she thought it was just the play of light, but the shadow became clearer and more unnatural. Peppa tried to call out to her parents, but they didn't respond, their faces empty. The shadow began to move closer, and Peppa felt her heart tighten with fear. She tried to find the light switch, but couldn't remember where it was. At that moment, the shadow appeared right in front of her. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a creature with huge, soulless eyes and a twisted body. Peppa screamed in terror, and at that moment, the light flickered back on. The shadow disappeared, as if it had never been there. But Peppa couldn't forget what she had seen. When she returned to her parents, they seemed just like usual, but something about their behavior was strange. They didn't notice how quickly it had gotten dark, nor were they concerned about the lights going out. Peppa decided she had to stay on guard. And though everything returned to normal, at night in her room, she often saw strange shadows sliding across the walls, sometimes moving as though they were watching her. Peppa Pig, the screen. It was a rainy evening at the Pig family home. Raindrops drummed against the windows and the wind howled through the pipes. Inside, the house was warm and cozy. Peppa and George sat on the floor playing with their toys, while Daddy Pig relaxed on the couch after a long day at work. The television flickered softly, filling the room with familiar sounds. Daddy lazily flipped through the channels, clicking the remote. But something was strange. The image on the screen trembled slightly, as if the TV couldn't focus. Sometimes the sound lagged behind, making the characters' mouths move out of sync. Daddy Pig frowned and tapped the remote against his palm. The screen flickered. At first, just a brief flash of static. Then the picture began to distort. The faces of the news anchors stretched unnaturally, their eyes turning empty, their voices muffled as if coming from deep underwater. Daddy Pig leaned closer, squinting at the screen. Suddenly the television flared with a bright white light. A cold gust of air seemed to rush from it, and the room felt thick and heavy, as if something unseen was pulling everything toward the screen. The couch trembled slightly. Daddy Pig reached for the remote, but his fingers slipped. He tried to pull back, but something was dragging him forward. First, just a little. Then, with a sudden yank, Peppa and George froze, unable to move. They watched as Daddy Pig was pulled toward the screen. His feet lifted off the ground, his hands clawed at the armrests, his face twisted in terror. It all happened in seconds. The last thing they saw were his outstretched hands, disappearing into the flickering light. Then the TV glitched once more, and a dead silence filled the room. Peppa took a hesitant step forward. George clutched his dinosaur, his breathing shaky. The screen flickered again. And then, movement. A shadow shifted behind the static. A face, pale, distorted, with hollow eyes. It looked like Daddy Pig, but something was wrong. His lips trembled as if he was trying to speak. But instead of words, a low, muffled sound came through, the sound of heavy breathing. The screen flashed one last time before turning completely black. The house fell silent again. Only the rain continued to tap against the glass. Peppa slowly took a step back. The television showed nothing now, but Peppa could feel that it was still watching. Missing Peppa. One evening, while Peppa and her family are preparing for dinner, Peppa decides she wants to play outside for a bit. Mummy and Daddy Pig don't mind since the weather is sunny and warm, and they tell her to come back before it gets dark. Peppa goes into the garden, playing with George and her toys. However, after a while, George comes back into the house, but Peppa stays outside. Her parents aren't worried, thinking she's just playing. But when night falls, Peppa still hasn't returned. Mummy and Daddy Pig start calling for her, but they can't find her either in the garden or in the house. Daddy Pig decides to go outside and look for her in the neighboring yards. He checks every corner, but there's no sign of Peppa. He calls the neighbors, but no one has seen her. While Daddy Pig and George continue searching for Peppa, Mummy Pig stays inside, feeling uneasy. Suddenly, as she walks down the hallway, she notices something strange on the floor. It's an old, forgotten teddy bear of Peppa's that she lost a long time ago. Mummy Pig picks up the toy and hears a strange noise, like something creaking from the other end of the house. She slowly walks toward the sound and discovers a door that was previously locked. The attic. Strange, but she doesn't remember anyone in the family ever opening it. When Mummy Pig opens the door, she is met with darkness and the smell of old dust. But deep inside the attic, she sees something strange. Small paw-like prints leading to an empty corner. Mummy Pig starts to feel that something isn't right. She senses an eerie presence, like someone is watching her. Suddenly, the light in the attic flickers, and she hears footsteps behind her. When she turns around, she sees a small shadow in the corner, resembling Peppa. "Peppa?" she quietly asks, but the girl doesn't answer. The shadow disappears, leaving behind barely noticeable marks. Mummy Pig runs through the house in panic, knowing that Peppa is somewhere nearby, but she can't find her. Daddy Pig, returning to the house, hears strange noises from the attic. He decides to go upstairs and, together with Mummy Pig, they open the door again. This time they see Peppa standing in the corner of the attic, her face seeming slightly altered, and her eyes gleaming like those of something unfamiliar. "Peppa?" Daddy Pig asks, but the girl remains silent, not moving. She starts to laugh softly, but the laugh sounds oddly hollow. Suddenly, the light in the attic goes out, and Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig find themselves in complete darkness. When the light turns back on, Peppa is gone. Only the teddy bear lying on the floor remains as a reminder of her presence. Peppa has vanished. Silence falls over the house again, and the parents realize that Peppa is gone for good. But the next morning, when they search the garden again, they find paw prints leading towards the forest, a place where Peppa has never gone before. Peppa Pig, the basement secret. For the past few weeks, Peppa had noticed strange things. Susie, Danny, Pedro, and Rebecca had stopped coming over to play. Whenever she asked about them, the adults would give vague answers. Even Mummy Pig seemed worried but avoided the topic. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, heavy footsteps and the creak of a door echoed through the house. Curiosity got the better of Peppa, and she carefully stepped out of her room. The hallway was dark, but a faint light was coming from downstairs. She crept down the stairs and saw that the basement door was slightly open. Inside, Daddy Pig stood with his back to her, rummaging through some boxes. In the far corner of the basement, there were cages. Inside them, dark figures barely moved. Her friends. They sat in silence, their eyes empty, as if they were unaware of what was happening. Peppa froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, but the floorboard beneath her let out a loud creak. Daddy Pig turned sharply. His face looked different, his eyes deeper and darker than usual. Slowly, he moved toward her. Peppa spun around and ran upstairs. She had to tell Mummy. Bursting into her parents' bedroom, she saw that Mummy Pig was already sitting up in bed. She looked as if she had been expecting her. For a few moments, they just stared at each other before Mummy Pig stood up, took Peppa's hoof, and led her out of the room. As they stepped into the hallway, Daddy Pig was already there. He didn't try to stop them. He just stood still, smiling. Suddenly, the house went dark. The last thing Peppa heard was the creak of the basement door opening, and voices whispering her name from the darkness. A rush of cold air swept through the hallway, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something metallic. Peppa whimpered as Mummy Pig tightened her grip on her hoof. There was no hesitation in Mummy Pig's steps as she led Peppa toward the stairs. But instead of heading down, she turned toward the attic ladder. Mummy, Peppa whispered, her voice barely audible over the strange murmurs growing louder from below. "Hush, darling," Mummy Pig whispered back, pulling the ladder down with a quiet snap. "We don't have much time." Peppa hesitated, glancing back. Daddy Pig remained where he stood, his grin never faltering, his shadow stretching unnaturally long in the dim light. The voices from the basement grew clearer now, calling her name in distorted, overlapping tones. A sudden crash from below sent a jolt through Peppa's body. She didn't want to go into the attic. She wanted to run, to escape. But Mummy Pig was insistent, guiding her up the rickety ladder. The attic was dark and cold. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and old furniture loomed like silent ghosts. Mummy Pig shut the hatch behind them and crouched beside Peppa, her breath shaky. "They know you saw them," she whispered. "They won't let you go now." A loud thud rattled the ceiling below. Peppa clung to her mother, her little heart hammering in her chest. Then, in the silence, a single voice cut through. "Peppa." It was Susie, right outside the attic door. Peppa Pig, the door to darkness. The day was gloomy and quiet. The wind rustled the trees outside, and the sky was covered with thick gray clouds. Peppa and George were playing in their room, building a tall tower out of blocks. The house felt especially cozy until it started to get dark. When Mummy Pig called them for dinner, Peppa stood up and accidentally knocked over the tower, sending the blocks tumbling to the floor. George whined in frustration, but Peppa wasn't paying attention anymore. She was staring at the corner of the room. There, where there had always been just a wall, now stood a door that had never been there before. It was tall, old, with a black handle. It looked out of place, as if it didn't belong in their house. Maybe Mummy and Daddy built a new storage closet, Peppa thought. But the idea sent a strange chill down her spine. George, forgetting about the fallen tower, also noticed the door and pressed himself against Peppa. Peppa took a step forward. The door was closed, but a cold draft seeped from the gap beneath it. She slowly reached out and touched the handle. It was freezing. And then the door creaked open slightly. Just a tiny bit, but it was enough. From the darkness inside came a soft rustling sound. Peppa and George froze, listening. No light, no voices. Just a faint scratching noise, like something in the shadows was dragging its claws across the floor. Peppa quickly pulled her hoof away. George gripped her dress tightly. And then the door started opening wider. Creak! The darkness behind it was too deep, unnatural, swallowing up all the light. Peppa instinctively stepped back. Then it appeared. Out of the blackness, a hoof slid into view. It looked like hers, but too long, with thin fingers instead of rounded edges. Then a second hoof emerged, and then a face peeked out. It was exactly like Peppa's, but its eyes were pitch black, empty, and its mouth— the mouth slowly stretched into an unnatural, wide grin. Peppa screamed and grabbed George's hoof. She bolted toward the hallway door. But then the light flickered. For a split second, everything was swallowed by total darkness. And when the light returned, the door was gone. All that remained was a blank wall, as if it had never existed. George whimpered, clutching Peppa's arm. She breathed heavily, eyes fixed on the spot where the door had been. Everything looked normal, but Peppa knew one thing for certain. It was still here, somewhere, watching.